Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and always a delight to have with us our good friend Wallace Henley, former aide in the Nixon White House and Congressional Chief of Staff and pastor, teacher, preacher. Not sure when he sleeps. Anyway, check out his book, Revival, Revolution, and Rebirth. He co-authored this book with Tom DeLay, former majority leader in the House. And boy, it has a lot to talk about as we relate now to a new administration. Wallace, my friend, good to see you. Got to take care of important business first, and that is being there in Houston, Texas. Falcons or the Patriots?
Well, irrelevant. Totally irrelevant.
Okay. Okay, got it.
In terms of the Houston Texans or the Dallas Cowboys, totally irrelevant.
Okay, I just kind of realized that probably what happened. The big blue star is on the ground somewhere.
It's on the ground somewhere, and we're going to sell a lot of stuff to people.
Okay, good to see you, my friend. How are you?
Doing great, thank you.
You bet. All right. Well, listen, thanks for your book. Let me encourage our viewers to check it out. It is a great book, and you may want to pick it up at the bookstores or look for it Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And that is called Revival, Revolution, and Rebirth, again, co-authored with Tom DeLay and Wallace Henley. All right, so we have a new president. Wallace, what did you think of his inaugural speech?
Well, I liked it, and I liked it because it was not just a bunch of platitudes. I thought he dealt with some very specific things, which I really appreciated. I did not support him in the primaries, but when it came down between Hillary and Trump, obviously I supported Trump. So I was pleased in general with his speech.
Quite an amazing speech, very pointed, and he did it with 4 former presidents sitting just feet behind him, and he put everything on warning. It was kind of bold, don't you think?
It was very bold, and you could see the little stiletto scratches in all of their corpuses, their political corpuses. They were bleeding. Some of them didn't know they were bleeding while they were bleeding, but they were bleeding nevertheless.
All right, so where do you think we are in your sequence of things? I know you're a great student of history, and you have co-authored this book about revival, revolution, rebirth. You've dealt with a lot of other sequences of things. Where do you think we are with the Trump presidency?
I think we're in the beginning, or maybe down the line a little bit, in the season of remembrance, when people are trying to figure out what was it we left behind. And in that regard, I was very happy that this, well, not happy, but I think it was opportune that this Women's March occurred on the day after, so that there would be such a startling contrast between the evil, the demonic evil that is still present in our land, and the overflow of prayer and worship that characterized the inauguration. So I'm thinking that people are wanting to remember, what did we leave behind? Let's go back and get it. Even an old guy like Trump, who probably has not walked in those things in his life. Nevertheless, he and his family seem to have evidence of trying to recover it.
Yeah, it seems to be there, even from a spiritual standpoint. He's allowing tremendous amount of Christian influence into his administration. Does that tell you anything?
It tells me a great deal, and I listened over the weekend. I was with a person who is very much involved inside that inner core. He's an evangelist, a pastor, and it reassured me about certain things about Trump himself. I thought maybe all of this was a political facade to get the evangelical vote. I wrote in the Christian Post, and I still stand by it, that we need not to be pronouncing at this point that Donald Trump is God's answer to all of our problems. He's not the Messiah. We need to see the fruit. But nevertheless, I'm encouraged that there may be something really in the depths here, not just on the surface.
All right, I want to come back to that, but I want to go back to the women's demonstration over the weekend. We had quite a few of them here in Oregon, too. We had one in the southern part of the state down in Ashland, one up in Portland where our governor even got up and spoke quite forcefully. I just was amazed at the vileness and the anger, and yet the amount of women. Can you tell me what they want?
Well, first of all, we have to think about this in terms of spiritual warfare. Jesus said, or Paul wrote in Ephesians 6, that our warfare is not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and the powers and the rulers of darkness. And certainly we saw those who look at things spiritually saw the evidence of the principalities emerging in the vileness that came out of that. And what they seem to want is not so much, well, what they seem to want is a desire to cast off all of the restraints except the restraints they want to impose on the rest of culture.
Well, it's an amazing, I think you're absolutely right. It shows the contrast. We got a lot of work to do. And at the same time, they're broken children. I mean, they need God.
And you want to weep. You listen to someone like Madonna or the other actress that spoke. You listen to folks like that, and you get angry at first, and then your heart just breaks that people could live in such darkness and not even understand it.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. All right, let's go back to Trump just for a few moments, Wallace. It appears that he's fulfilling some campaign promises. They're only a couple of days on the job now, working hard. He took on the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. He kind of axed that. But yesterday, he also signed the Mexico City policy, or at least he reinstated it, that none of our tax dollars would go to non-government agencies outside the countries that are performing abortions. This has got to be a sign of a good thing to come.
This is a sign of good thing to come, and I've been working very intensely on a piece recently for one of the entities I write for on is there political will in Washington now to really do something significant to restrain abortion, including the defunding of Planned Parenthood. And I've been talking to a lot of people on the Hill and in other areas of policy making, and there's a consensus that maybe Trump really is going to follow through with this. Was it just a campaign promise to get the evangelicals? Right now, it does not appear so. It appears that it was a very sincere commitment. And I wrote in the Christian Post way back there during before the election that I was not necessarily voting for Trump, but I was certainly voting for Pence. And those people who will see to it, I think, that Trump will follow through on those kinds of commitments.
All right. So do you think the will is within the House and the Senate to support him on this? I mean, they have been so established that they can't move.
Well, the Republican establishment's beginning to move a little bit. That's one of the things that I watch for. I know what the Democrats are going to do, and with the exception of one or two conservative Democrats, if that's not a contradiction. But nevertheless, there seems to be even a growing understanding among the more moderate Republicans, and folks don't really understand just where those moderate Republicans have stood. I ran for Congress in 2000 here in the 7th Congressional District, West Houston, and in the primaries, I was the bad boy to those moderate Republicans. I was absolutely to be cast out of the village by the folks that wanted to hold on to a view of abortion, and they were rhinos, of course. We have a term for them. But even those rhinos are beginning to crack a little bit. So maybe that means that we're going to have a different day.
You know what's interesting about this, Wallace? We do a lot of generational science research here at the Dove for various reasons as it relates to broadcasting. And I am pleased to see that the millennials, for the most part, are pro-life. They get it. That's a good sign.
That is one of the most positive things about the millennials. And of course, part of what has helped drive that is the exposure of what Planned Parenthood really does. I will never forget, and I think about 1997, the church I was pastoring at that time, the global G7 presidents and prime ministers were meeting in Houston at Rice University. And we did a Cemetery of the Innocents right across the street in a huge park, Memorial Park, right across the street from Rice University, so that those heads of state would see the number of crosses and stars of David that represented the number of children killed just in one day through abortion. Wow. And we had to have 2.5 acres. But here's what happened. At some point when we were setting up the crosses and the stars of David, the Houston Police Department came to me and they said, Queer Nation is going to demonstrate against you guys, and they have balloons filled with semen, and they're going to throw it at your people. We had about 200 people out there planting these crosses and stars of David that symbolize the grave sites. And they said, you're going to have to protect them. So we had to devise a plan that would cluster the people right in the middle of that 2.5 acre tract in case that happened, and indeed it did. But the Houston police surrounded us and they protected us, and it was one of the most moving things that I've ever lived through in my life.
Wow. Well, I think we have all of the elements in place to see Planned Parenthood defunded. And this is going to be a remarkable thing to see happen. I'm sure there's going to be an outrage, but at the end of the day, the majority of the country now wants abortion stopped. And we'll see, but boy, it's sure looking good. Let me take a quick break. Wallace, when we come back, I want to talk to you about Israel, and in particular, it looks like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been invited to the White House in February. Hopefully he goes through the front door. We'll talk about that when we come back with our good friend Wallace Henley.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Welcome back to Focus Today, and delighted to have back with us our good friend Wallace Henley, former aide in the Nixon White House and Congressional Chief of Staff and teaching pastor at the Second Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. He writes all kinds of books, but this is the one I think you ought to grab now and take a read. It is really fitting, and it fits well with where we are in our nation. It's called Revival, Revolution, and Rebirth. He's co-authored this with former majority of the House, leader of the House, and that is Tom DeLay. Wallace, it looks like the president is leaning very heavily towards moving the embassy from Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem, which is going to send a huge statement and maybe cause some problems. But I think Netanyahu is ready for it. What do you think?
Well, I think obviously it's going to exacerbate tensions considerably. But at the same time, as you say, it will be a profound statement of the United States returning to its very strong alliance with Israel. And I think that's very important, not only from a biblical standpoint, I think it's very important from a worldview standpoint, that this is the nation in the midst of that ocean of chaos that holds to a worldview that presents to the nation, to the world, the globe itself, what a Judeo-Christian worldview looks like. Reuters this week carried a very interesting story about how Israeli army medical people are taking care of Syrian warriors who've been wounded and who come across the border bleeding, and they take them in. Well, this is the nature of the Judeo-Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. Even though Israel itself, I think, and it's important to emphasize this, is a secular state. In fact, it's very secular, more secular than I would like personally. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, that worldview does prevail.
Well, it looks like it's going to happen, which is going to be very, very interesting. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is scheduled to be back at the White House in February, and I'm hoping he'll go all the way out and hold him a state dinner just to kind of reverse the action and how he was treated under the Obama administration. But as President Obama was hours from going to the inauguration of Donald Trump, sent $221 million to the Palestinian Authority at the last minute. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that we've had an alien presidency, and I'm not a birther. I'm not talking about the birther stuff. Mm-hmm. I wrote last week or this week in the Christian Post about the covenant aspects of our founding, and the American founders based their foundation on a biblical covenant. The progressivists who have ruled through Obama, on the other hand, sort of emphasize a Darwinian social evolution theory as their foundation. So we've had a covert government. We've had an alien government, alien from our worldview, alien from our philosophy, and the only way they could govern was through these kind of covert things, sometimes not so covert, like the funding of Iran, but nevertheless, these covert actions that were fulfilling their agenda.
All right. One of the things that President Trump said he would do quickly, at least within 2 weeks, maybe even this week, is name a Supreme Court justice nominee to take Justice Scalia's place. I don't know who that would be, but we have an indication of that it's going to be a conservative person. But mixed into that was a meeting with Judge Napolitano from Fox News. I don't know. What do you think? Would you be okay with him?
Well, probably not. I would not be happy with anyone who's a commentator at this particular point, because I think that person has their own actual degrees and keep going and so on. I would much prefer an ideologue on the scale and at the depth of Justice Scalia. My wife and I some years ago were in a room where Justice Scalia was speaking, and when he began his speech, she said, "What is he saying?" And I said, "I have no clue. It is so deep."
Your job was to pretend you knew.
yeah, I was supposed to say, "Oh, well, dear, I'll explain it later." Yeah. But actually, I had to say, "Honey, I don't have any idea. I just know it's really, really good. I like it."
Oh, boy, I've been trapped with that so many times. Wow, especially in interviews with people like you. All right, the president put a hiring freeze on federal employees after the former president did a quick hire everybody you can as he was going out the door. The last president, if I remember correctly, to do this was President Nixon. He did a hiring and a spending freeze, didn't he?
Exactly. At that point, of course, we were dealing with a very serious inflationary crisis. And he had imposed wage and price controls on the American economy, and he felt like the government ought to lead the way, and so that's what happened, and it set an example.
So, what's the residual effect of this? I mean, we're just freezing everything. He may even go as far as rumors are that he may say to some of the agencies, cut back 3-4%. I mean, that's significant.
It's very, very important, and here's why. It's almost a backdoor approach to forcing zero-based budgeting. And this has been one of the contentions in Congress for some time, as you well know, that maybe we need to use a zero-based approach. Tom DeLay and I talk about that in the book that you've mentioned so generously, that we need to get those departments to a zero base rather than simply saying that federal spending is slowing down, when in reality all that's slowing down is the rate of expansion on spending, the rate of expansion on hiring. We need to get to a point where it truly is a zero base that we build on.
Well, I guess we're going to see that, and that's one way maybe to fund the military, is you just stop spending and let some of that resource go over there, because otherwise, where's the money going to come from?
Well, I know of a particular individual who is he's an officer in the Marines who works very hard every day being a Marine, and then on the weekends he works at a Home Depot or Lowe's, and this is abominable.
Yeah, that's crazy. Let me ask you this. The bust has been returned to the Oval Office. It came out of the back room somewhere, so I'm sure our friends in Britain are happy. Will Prime Minister Theresa May and Donald Trump get along? And in addition to that, it looks like Brexit isn't really finished yet. It's got to go through Parliament.
Right.
I can't imagine, if they don't go through with this, what's going to happen over there. Your thoughts?
I think there will be a citizens' revolution of some kind in Britain if that falls apart. Yes, I think that there will be some restraints on the relationship between May and Trump, simply because those around May, who is a conservative, of course, and those in the Parliament will try to keep her from getting too friendly with Trump. I think it's kind of like Moses and Churchill have been returned to the Oval Office, and instead of Mohammed. And I do hope that very much that Trump kept the statue, the bust of Martin Luther King. I was in Alabama during that particular movement. I supported it. I covered it as a news writer and as an editorial writer. And I think Dr. King set a tremendous example of how to exert cultural change in a society. So I'm grateful for that.
It looks like there's 3 busts now in the Oval Office. You got Lincoln, King, and Churchill. Right. It makes quite the statement for them to be there. There's no question about it.
Yeah, in the background, you may be able to see my big picture of Moses back here on the the wall behind me.
Yeah,
I've thought about sending that to Trump. It's an awesome sketch done in pencil and ink, but I'm probably not going to do it.
All right, so your senator, Ted Cruz, ran, didn't get elected, didn't make it through the primary, but he seems to be fairly strong and could be quite the asset for President Trump in the Senate. And he's pushing hard term limits, something that Trump ran on. What do you think?
Well, of course, term limits is a very intensely debatable topic.
Right.
On the one hand, I really do desire someone who has some experience at some level of government. On the other hand, that somehow needs to be limited and restrained. And I think it even needs to be limited and restrained on the Supreme Court. I think across the board, we need to have people who are seasoned. I think Trump brings some things intellectually to the presidency, and people will laugh at me for saying that, but I think he brings some things intellectually to the presidency that will be refreshing.
Right.
I think his entrepreneurial understanding, his knowledge of business, the way business works, I think all of those things will be extremely beneficial to the nation. On the other hand, when we get someone in office who is so deeply intellectual that they have a cause that they're there to battle, no matter what the interests of the nation and no matter what the principles of the nation, then definitely term limits would help to address that.
Well, and some would say, well, we got term limits. The House is every 2 years, the Senate's every 6, and the people, if they want them out, they vote them out. But most people will agree with you that probably term limits on everything across the board, especially the Supreme Court.
Exactly.
So I don't know. We'll have to see how that plays out. Well, this is very interesting. How do you feel in your heart today, Wallace, about what God is doing in America?
I believe God is responding to prayers that have been going up for a long time. And I believe what we're seeing is the beginning of something that may lead to a very significant revival in the sequence that Tom DeLay and I talk about. And that sequence is not something we invented. It's the sequence that appears in the book of Judges, where we have this ratification, where there's general consensus around the idea that God exists, God is on the throne. That was the ratification from the time of the Mayflower Compact all the way to 1787 and the writing of the Constitution. That's ratification. Then that generation dies. Joshua's generation dies. Then we go into a period of the relapse of memory. Then we go into a time, logically, of rebellion. Once you forget, you rebel. Then we go into a time of the refiner's fire, the consequences. Then we come into this remembrance period that I think we've entered now. But then next, we go into a time of repentance, national repentance. Oh, Lord, what have we done? And we are a covenant nation, which means that we have executed our agreements from the Mayflower Compact all the way down to the Constitution on the basis of coram Deo, which means before God. We have executed those covenants before God. And therefore, we recognize that we're accountable to God. When we forget that and we move into this progressive social evolution idea that comes, which is strictly Darwinian, and we move into that, that's why I say that it's alien. So God allows the consequence of our choice, Romans 1. He allows it to happen, but then we come to repentance, remembrance, repentance, and then comes revival. So I'm kind of excited about the future, I have to tell you.
Well, as we go from remembrance into repentance, that would suggest a return of morality, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes.
And that's got to be very encouraging.
I think what God will do, I keep thinking over and over that passage where Jesus prophesied that the time would come when what is done in the corner would be shouted from the housetops. Wow. And Donald Trump has had to go through that. His ugliness. I mean, I watched a video yesterday that John Piper circulated. I'd not seen the actual video of Trump's comments, of his very ugly comments. God arranged for that to be broadcast so that Donald Trump, perhaps, and those around him would see just how evil he could be. And God allowed this awful, ugly explosion last Saturday in that women's march. Now, this Friday, we have the March for Life coming up in Washington, and there will be a dramatic contrast, and the nation can see it, and that's very important.
Very important it is. Well, let me encourage you folks. By the way, Wallace's website is wallacehenley.net. You can check out his books at just about any of the bookstores, but let me encourage you to get this one. It's called Revival, Revolution, Rebirth, co-authored with Tom DeLay. Very timely and a great read. In fact, you won't just read it and put it down. You'll go back and mark it up. And pastors, there's so many sermons in there, you can give Wallace credit for it. Good to see you, buddy. Let's stay in touch, and we'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you.
All right. God bless. All right. We'll be right back.